A Chinese court historian once wrote that the people across the Eastern Sea possessed a script so old that even his own scholars could not decipher its roots. He filed the report. Then someone buried it. That single sentence, recovered from a partial Qing-era administrative document, sits at the center of one of Southeast Asia's most contested linguistic puzzles. Not a conspiracy, not a myth. A bureaucratic paper trail that took 3 centuries to surface. And when it did, it forced a quiet but significant re-examination of what we thought we knew about Philippine civilization. The story isn't about villains hiding truth in a vault. It's about money, political optics, and the very human tendency of institutions to protect their own prestige. Emperors ran empires the way studios run franchises. Inconvenient data gets shelved, not out of evil genius, out of paperwork cowardice. So let's talk about what the linguistic evidence actually shows, and why it matters more now than at any point in the last 500 years. Wait a second. The Baybayin script gets referenced constantly in Filipino cultural discourse. T-shirts, tattoos, government logos. But the script itself is almost always treated as a curiosity, something pre-colonial, something quaint. What it rarely gets treated as is evidence. Hard, structural, phonological evidence of a linguistic tradition that developed independently of Sinitic influence and, by conservative scholarly dating, predates several of the Chinese writing systems that Southeast Asian languages supposedly borrowed from. Baybayin belongs to the Brahmic family. That much is agreed upon. But the specific divergence point, the moment when Proto-Philippine scripts broke away from their Indian-influenced ancestors and developed their own phonological logic, that's where the debate gets expensive. Expensive in the academic sense. Careers get staked on these positions. By the way, the dominant narrative for decades placed Philippine linguistic development firmly downstream of Chinese trade contact. The logic seemed clean. Trade routes, borrowed vocabulary, cultural diffusion. Simple, fundable. The kind of thesis that gets grants approved. Then archaeologists started finding things that didn't cooperate with the timeline. Incidentally, the Laguna Copperplate inscription, dated 900 CE, is the oldest known written document found in the Philippines. To be honest, it's written in a mixture of Old Malay, Old Javanese, and Sanskrit. Zero Chinese. The document records a debt settlement, not a tribute, not a trade agreement dictated by a foreign power. A local legal transaction conducted by people who had their own administrative and legal vocabulary, entirely separate from Chinese frameworks. A society sophisticated enough to have debt law doesn't build that infrastructure overnight. It accumulates over generations of linguistic and cultural development. But the copperplate is just the surface layer. Beneath it sits something far older and far less discussed. The proto-languages that linguists reconstruct by working backward from modern Philippine tongues, Tagalog, Ilocano, Cebuano, Kapampangan, point to a Proto-Philippine stage that separated from Proto-Malayo-Polynesian roughly 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years. That's not a medieval footnote. That's a Bronze Age root system, and the phonological structures embedded in those reconstructed protoforms show no evidence of early Sinitic borrowing at the foundational level. The borrowed Chinese vocabulary in Philippine languages appears late, trade era late, surface level late. The bones of the language predate the contact. This is the point where the producer's instinct kicks in. Why didn't this narrative dominate? Who controlled the framing? Well, the answer isn't a shadow council. The answer is imperial bureaucracy, doing what imperial bureaucracy always does, optimizing for the story that kept the center of power central. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, Chinese imperial documentation of Southeast Asian peoples followed a consistent editorial logic. Tributary states got detailed records. Independent civilizations with no political relationship to the court got categorized as peripheral. The Philippines, never a tributary state, never under Chinese administrative control, appeared in Chinese records primarily as trade partners and occasionally as geographic curiosities. The documentation wasn't falsified. It was selectively thin. And thin documentation, repeated across centuries, creates the impression of a shallow history. There's a catch. The Qing-era document mentioned at the start of this video was part of a larger administrative review of maritime trade records. When scholars in the late 20th century began systematically digitizing and cross-referencing Qing archives, several documents surfaced that referenced Philippine area scripts as linguistically autonomous, meaning the Chinese administrators who encountered them recognized that these writing systems didn't derive from Chinese. That's a significant internal acknowledgement. The administrators who wrote those assessments weren't cultural anthropologists. They were trade bureaucrats doing due diligence, and their due diligence accidentally produced some of the most honest external documentation of Philippine linguistic independence in the pre-colonial record. Those documents stayed in institutional archives for reasons that had nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with academic jurisdiction. Chinese historical archives, even partially, weren't systematically accessible to Filipino or international researchers until relatively recently. The delay wasn't malice. It was bureaucratic inertia and the slow grind of archival access negotiations between institutions. But the effect was the same as if someone had locked the door. Stop for a second. Think about what that actually means for how the Philippines understands its own past. 3 centuries of external documentation sitting in a building that the people it describes couldn't enter. The Visayan oral traditions compound this picture in ways that written records alone can't. Among the indigenous communities of the Visayas, oral historians, the Babaylan tradition, preserved linguistic genealogies, not metaphorical ones. Actual structured recitations of vocabulary chains that linguists, when they finally began systematic fieldwork in the 20th century, identified as preserving archaic phonological features absent from later trade-influenced Tagalog. These weren't frozen museum pieces. They were living administrative technologies of a society that chose oral precision over written record, a choice that made sense in a humid, typhoon-prone archipelago where copper and stone outlasted paper, but where human memory, carefully trained, outlasted both. Important. The Babaylan weren't mystics who happened to remember old words. They were professional knowledge keepers in a society that invested significant social capital in the maintenance of linguistic integrity. That's an institutional choice. That's a budget decision in the broadest sense of the term. Someone decided that training and sustaining these specialists was worth the community's resources. That decision preserved linguistic data for 2,000 years. Stop. The irony is rich. A society without an imperial bureaucracy preserved more accurate linguistic history than the imperial bureaucracy that documented it. Now consider the commercial dimension of the suppressed narrative, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting from a historical production standpoint. Well, when Spanish colonizers arrived in the 16th century, they encountered a literate population. Primary sources from the early contact period, Pigafetta's journals, early Augustinian records, note with consistent surprise that Filipinos wrote and read at rates that exceeded contemporary European literacy averages. Pigafetta himself observed this. The Spanish colonial administration, faced with a literate subject population, made a calculated decision to redirect that literacy. They encouraged Baybayin use initially for practical missionary purposes, then systematically replaced it with the Latin alphabet over subsequent generations. This wasn't accidental cultural erosion. It was administered, deliberate, a policy with implementation and budget lines. Think about it. The administrators who designed that policy understood exactly what they were doing. Redirecting a population's writing system redirects their relationship with their own historical documents. Within 2 to 3 generations, the majority of the population couldn't read the texts their grandparents had written. The colonial administration didn't need to burn every document. They just needed to change the operating system. What survived did so through the same mechanism that kept the oral traditions alive. Individual humans who decided the knowledge was worth carrying forward. Scribes who kept private Baybayin documents. Families who taught the script quietly. Community archivists who understood that what they held was irreplaceable. Their stubbornness is, functionally, the reason this conversation is possible today. Stop. The linguistic evidence that has emerged from 20th and 21st century scholarship paints a picture that is simultaneously more complex and more impressive than the simplified narratives on either side. Philippine languages didn't develop in isolation. No language does. They absorbed Sanskrit vocabulary through Indic trade contact. They absorbed Malay structural elements through Austronesian migration. They absorbed Chinese trade vocabulary through centuries of commerce. And through all of that absorption, the foundational phonological and grammatical architecture, the actual deep structure, remained distinctly, stubbornly, demonstrably Philippine. That distinction matters because it's the difference between a culture that borrowed tools and a culture that built its own house. Stop. The 3 lines of evidence converge here into something coherent. The archaeological record, starting from the Laguna Copperplate and working backward through linguistic reconstruction, establishes an indigenous timeline that predates Chinese administrative contact at the structural level. The Chinese archival documents, now accessible to researchers, provide external confirmation that even the people doing the documenting recognized the autonomy of Philippine linguistic systems. And the oral traditions, preserved through an institutional commitment that colonial administrators underestimated, provide the living connective tissue between ancient phonology and modern identity. None of these arguments require a secret cabal. None require classified truth bombs. What they require is patience, archival access, and the willingness to take seriously a body of evidence that spent 3 centuries being filed in the wrong drawer. All right. That court historian who wrote about the undecipherable script of the Eastern Sea people, he wasn't hiding anything. He was doing his job. He noted something he couldn't explain, filed the report, and moved on to the next trade season. The system around him decided the report wasn't worth elevating. Well, 300 years later, researchers are pulling that report out of a database and realizing the man was onto something. The people he described hadn't borrowed their language from anyone. They'd built it themselves. On an archipelago in the middle of a typhoon belt, across 7,000 islands, over 4,000 years, they'd built something that even a Chinese imperial bureaucrat with no particular reason to be generous recognized as autonomous. That's not a classified secret. That's a historical fact that got lost in someone's filing system. And the difference between those 2 things is everything.